She was mopping the corridor when the old man collapsed near the entrance. No one else moved. She did. She had his wound dressed and his breathing stabilized before anyone at the front desk finished, deciding whether to call a supervisor. The CEO fired her for it. Protocol, he said. Liability. She left without a word. But the veteran watched her go, and then he reached for his phone. 10 minutes later, a military helicopter landed in the hospital parking lot. A general walked through the sliding doors, his expression calm and deliberate, and asked the room a single question that nobody there was prepared to answer. St. Mercy Hospital sat at the edge of the city, where the older neighborhoods met the newer ones, and on most mornings it ran with the efficient indifference of a place that had long since stopped pretending medicine and money were separate concerns. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and recycled air. The fluorescent lights in the east wing flickered twice every hour with the reliability of a clock nobody had bothered to fix. Orderlies moved between wards with their eyes down, and the front desk staff had perfected the particular expression of people trained to assess a patient's insurance status before their symptoms. Rosa Mendez had worked the early morning shift at St. Mercy for 14 months. She arrived before most of the clinical staff, pushed her cart through the ground floor corridors in the gray uniform that made her functionally invisible to anyone above a certain pay grade, and did her work with the quiet focus of someone who had decided long ago that the task in front of her was the only thing worth thinking about. The senior nurses knew her name. The doctors rarely looked up when she passed. The CEO had never once acknowledged her existence, which suited Rosa fine. She moved differently from the other cleaning staff, though most people never noticed. Her routes through the ward were efficient in a way that went beyond habit. She positioned herself near the areas of highest foot traffic during peak hours, cleared obstacles from pathways before anyone asked, and had a way of reading a room's tension from the doorway before entering. A young orderly named Thomas had once mentioned to a colleague that watching Rosa work felt oddly like watching someone run a security sweep. His colleague had laughed and moved on. Rosa had said nothing because she hadn't been meant to hear it. That Tuesday morning carried the particular stillness that precedes difficult shifts. Rain moved in slow sheets across the parking lot outside, and the ambulance bay lights threw pale orange reflections across the wet asphalt. Rosa was finishing the corridor near the east entrance when the automatic doors slid open and let in a gust of cold air, along with the sound of someone struggling on the front steps. The man was old, perhaps 70, wearing a military jacket so worn that the patches on the sleeves had faded to outlines. He had made it through the doors on his own before his legs gave way, and he went down hard against the linoleum floor, one hand catching the wall just enough to slow the fall. The cut above his ear was already bleeding, a steady dark line tracking down the side of his face and disappearing into the collar of his jacket. He was conscious. His eyes were open and calm in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with a man who had been in worse situations and knew how to stay present inside. Them, the two staff members near the front desk, looked up. One reached for the phone. The other glanced toward the triage bay and then back at the man on the floor, and the brief calculation behind his eyes was not difficult to read. No lanyard, no registration folder, no one accompanying him who might produce paperwork. Rosa had already set down her mop. She crossed the corridor in 9 steps, knelt beside the man, and had 2 fingers at his pulse before either desk attendant had finished their calculation. His heart rate was elevated but stable. The laceration above his ear was deep enough to need closure, but not so deep as to suggest arterial involvement. His pupils were equal. His breathing, though slightly labored, was controlled rather than distressed. "Sir," she said quietly, "stay still for a moment." He looked at her with the calm gray eyes of someone who had received instructions in difficult circumstances before and knew how to follow them. Not planning on going anywhere, he said. She had a clean cloth from her cart pressed against the wound before the desk attendant reached them. We need to get him to triage, Rosa said, looking up. The bleeding needs to be controlled. The attendant crouched slightly, lowering his voice as though proximity made the policy less uncomfortable. He hasn't registered. We can't move him to a treatment bay without intake authorization unless the attending on call declares it an emergency. Rosa looked at the blood moving steadily through the cloth in her hand. Call the attending, she said. I'll stay with him until you do. The attendant straightened and moved back toward the desk. Rosa turned back to the old man, adjusting the pressure of the cloth with the practiced ease of someone calibrating force against fragility. Around them, the corridor continued its morning rhythm. Wheels on linoleum, a distant monitor, the low hum of the building's ventilation, as though a man bleeding on the floor was simply one more variable in a system designed to process variables efficiently. You work here, the old man said. It was not a question. 14 months, Rosa said. He studied her hands for a moment. The way she had positioned herself beside him, one knee grounded, her weight distributed low and stable, her attention divided precisely between the wound and the room around them. Before that? He asked. Rosa didn't answer immediately. She checked the cloth, applied slightly more pressure, and glanced toward the desk where the attendant was speaking, into the phone with the unhurried pace of someone who believed the situation was under control because someone else was handling it. Before that was a long time ago. She sighed. The old man gave a faint nod, as though the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He said nothing further. Rosa stayed beside him, her hands steady, the gray corridor humming around them both, until the sound of sharp footsteps announced that the morning's real difficulty had not yet arrived. The CEO's name was Gerald Holt, and he moved through St. Mercy with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told that a room he entered did not belong to him. He was tall, expensively dressed in the way that communicated budget meetings rather than boardrooms, and his voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had learned that speaking before others, finished thinking, was an effective form of control. He appeared at the end of the east corridor with his phone in one hand and his gaze already moving across the scene with the speed of someone totaling a bill. He stopped when he saw Rosa. Not the old man on the floor. Rosa, the expression that crossed Gerald Holt's face was not anger, not yet. It was the particular tightening of a man who has encountered something that does not fit the category he has already assigned it to. A cleaning employee kneeling on the floor of the east corridor, pressing a cloth against a patient's head, wound with the composed attention of someone who had not once looked up to check whether she had permission. What is this? He said. Not a question. A categorization. The desk attendant straightened immediately. Sir, the patient came in through the east entrance without registration. A brief pause, the pronoun slightly uncertain. The cleaning staff intervened before we could complete intake. Holt's gaze moved to Rosa. Your facilities, he said. Yes, Rosa said. She did not look up from the wound. Then you have no business touching a patient. His voice had not risen. It carried instead the flat certainty of someone accustomed to corrections landing without resistance. Step back and let the clinical staff handle this. Rosa checked the pressure of the cloth. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. The old man's pulse, which she had checked twice since kneeling down, remained stable. The attending hasn't arrived yet, she said. The wound needs continuous pressure. I didn't ask for your assessment. Holt said. The corridor had grown quiet in the particular way that Institutional spaces go quiet when authority performs itself for an audience. Two nurses who had been moving between wards had slowed without stopping entirely. An orderly near the supply room door had found a reason to stay at the threshold. The desk attendant stood with his hands at his sides, looking at a point roughly between Holt and Rosa. The old man on the floor said nothing. He watched Holt with the calm gray eyes he had turned on Rosa earlier, and the absence of anxiety in his expression was, if anything, more unsettling than distress would have been. Holt stepped closer. "I'm telling you to step back." Rosa looked up at him for the first time. Her expression was not defiant. It was simply direct, the face of someone who has decided that the clearest response to an unclear situation is clarity. "If I remove pressure before the attending arrives, the bleeding will increase," she said. "I'll step back the moment someone qualified takes over." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Several people in the corridor counted them without meaning to. Holt's voice dropped slightly, which was worse than if it had risen. "You are a cleaning employee. You are not qualified to make that judgment. You are not qualified to touch a patient. And you are currently creating a liability situation for this institution that I will not allow to continue." He paused. "Step back, now." Rosa looked once at the old man on the floor. He had tracked the entire exchange with the same unhurried attention, and when her eyes met his, something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not sympathy, not pity, but the quiet acknowledgement of one person recognizing something in another that most of the room had missed entirely. She followed Holt down the corridor. The conversation in his office lasted 6 minutes. Rosa knew because she counted. Holt spoke for most of it, moving through the architecture of institutional consequence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered this particular structure before: liability, protocol, the integrity of clinical boundaries, the impossibility of exceptions. Rosa said 3 things across the 6 minutes: that the patient had been bleeding, that no clinical staff had responded, and that she had done what the situation required. Holt did not engage with any of the 3. He had not asked questions. He had constructed a conclusion and was furnishing it. When he finished, he told her to surrender her access badge at the front desk and that security would escort her from the building. Her final pay would be processed within the standard window. Rosa stood, removed her badge from its lanyard, and placed it on his desk. Holt had already looked back at his phone. She walked back through the corridor, toward the east entrance, past the triage bay where Dr. Reyes was completing the closure on the old man's wound, past the desk attendant who looked at the middle distance as she passed, past the 2 nurses who had watched the earlier confrontation and now found the monitors at their stations. Requiring close attention, she collected her jacket from the staff room and pushed through the east doors into the rain. The cold hit her face precisely where Holt's hand had landed during the final moment of their meeting, a detail that the corridor's witnesses had absorbed in silence, and that had lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the room resumed its practiced indifference. Rosa stood under the narrow overhang above the staff entrance, the rain moving in gray curtains across the parking lot, and felt the familiar weight of a system choosing its own continuity over the thing it was built to serve. She had felt it before, in a different context, in a different uniform, in places where the consequences of that choice were measured differently. She reached into her jacket pocket and touched something small and metal that she carried, but rarely thought about anymore. Then she withdrew her hand and looked out at the parking lot. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see the east corridor returning to its morning rhythm. And somewhere inside, she knew, the old man was sitting upright on a triage bed with a clean closure above his ear, watching the doors through which she had just walked out. He had his phone in his hand before the doors finished closing. She didn't see him dial. She didn't hear the 2 sentences he spoke into the receiver, quiet and precise, with the tone of someone issuing a notification rather than making a request. She was already at the far edge of the overhang, calculating whether the rain was light enough to walk to the bus stop without shelter, when the old man put the phone back into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and looked toward the ceiling with an expression that the desk attendant, had he been watching, might have described as patient. 11 minutes later. The windows of the east corridor filled with faces. The sound had arrived first, a low mechanical rhythm that grew from background noise to physical presence, pressing against the glass and rattling the supply cart near the triage bay. Then the helicopter came into view above the tree line at the edge of the parking lot. Military markings clear, even through the rain-streaked windows. Its size wrong for a medical transfer, and its approach pattern wrong for an emergency landing. It descended with the deliberate control of a vehicle whose pilot had been told exactly where to put it and had no interest in discussion. It settled in the center of the staff parking area. The rotor wash bent the nearby trees sideways and scattered a cluster of paper, coffee cups across the asphalt in a wide arc. Inside the hospital, Gerald Holtz stood among his staff at the corridor windows and felt the morning's certainty begin to develop. A fault line he could not yet locate. The helicopter's side door opened before the rotors had fully slowed, and 2 uniformed soldiers stepped down onto the wet asphalt with the practiced efficiency of people who did not regard unfamiliar ground as an obstacle. They moved to either side of the aircraft door and stood without speaking, their eyes moving across the parking lot in the methodical pattern of people trained to read environments rather than simply observe them. Then the general stepped out. He was not the tallest person to have walked through St. Mercy's doors that morning, nor the loudest, nor the most visibly armed. What he carried instead was the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years in rooms where the consequences of decisions were measured in lives rather than budgets. He wore his uniform without performance. He looked at the hospital building once, directly, the way a person looks at something they have already decided to enter, and then he walked toward the entrance at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, but simply purposeful, in the way that made the 2 soldiers fall into position behind him. Without a word exchanged, automatic doors opened. The east corridor, which had been gradually recovering its morning rhythm since Rose's departure, went completely silent. The general stopped just inside the entrance and looked across the space with the same methodical attention his soldiers had given the parking lot. His gaze moved across the desk attendants, the nurses who had drifted toward the windows, the orderly still standing at the supply room threshold. The triage bay, where the old man's bed was now empty, its paper cover still faintly creased from the shape of a person recently present. Gerald Holt stepped forward from the small crowd that had gathered near the corridor windows. He had reassembled his authority into something that resembled its earlier form, though the edges were less clean than they had been an hour ago. "This is a private medical facility," he said. "That landing was unauthorized, and I need to know immediately where's the woman who helped my soldier?" The general said. He did not raise his voice. He did not direct the question at Holt specifically. He addressed it to the room, the way a person asks a question when they understand that the answer exists somewhere in the space and they are simply waiting for it to surface. Holt blinked. "I'm sorry?" "An elderly man. Head wound. He was helped by a woman from your cleaning staff." The general's eyes had not stopped moving across the room. "Where is she?" "That situation has been dealt with," Holt said. "The employee in question violated clinical protocol, and her employment has been—" "I didn't ask about her employment." The sentence was quiet. It landed in the corridor the way a door, closing quietly, lands harder than one that is slammed. Because the control required to close it, that way is its own form of statement. A nurse near the reception desk shifted her weight. Another looked briefly toward the east entrance doors, through which Rosa headed. Walked 30 minutes earlier. The general saw both. Movements dot at that moment the east. Doors opened, and the old man walked in from the rain. The bandage above his ear white against his weathered skin. His worn military jacket darkened at the shoulders where the water had soaked through. He moved with the careful steadiness of someone whose body had reported an injury and been overruled by a more senior authority. When the general turned and saw him, something in the controlled stillness of his expression changed in a way that was small and precise, a shift of perhaps 2 degrees. The kind of adjustment that belongs to people who know each other well enough that words are often redundant. "Chief Navarro," the general said. The old man returned the nod. "General," he said. The exchange lasted 3 seconds and contained, for those who knew how to read it, an entire account of a shared history that the East Corridor of St. Mercy Hospital was entirely unequipped to. CONTEXTUALIZE. Gerald Holt looked between them. The confidence in his posture had not disappeared, but it had changed character. The way a man who has been standing on what he believed was solid ground changes his stance slightly when he begins to suspect the surface. "You know each other," he said. It came out less like a challenge than he had intended. Chief Navarro looked toward the east doors. "That woman," he said, "stopped my bleeding when 3 people behind that desk were still deciding whether I existed on paper." He looked back at Holt without particular heat. "She used her hands and her judgment, and she kept the wound from getting worse until your doctor arrived." He paused. "I've had that done for me before. Usually it happened in conditions considerably less comfortable than this corridor." Holt's jaw tightened. "She is not clinical staff. She had no authorization to." The general reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a small military-grade tablet. He did not make a performance of it. He simply held it at reading height, his eyes moving across the screen with the focused brevity of someone who has already read the document and is now locating a specific passage. "Rosa Elena Mendez," he said. The name in his voice was different from the name in Holt's files. It carried weight that administrative records do not assign. The corridor was very quiet. "Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy, attached to a Special Reconnaissance Support Unit for a period of 4 years." He looked up briefly, his gaze moving across the nurses and doctors who had gathered at the edges of the space. Several of them had stopped pretending to be there for other reasons. Deployed twice. Commended for field medical performance on both deployments. Holt shook his head with the impatience of a man trying to reestablish the frame of a conversation that has drifted past his control. Whatever her background, she is employed here as 3 years ago. The general continued, as though Holt had not spoken. Her unit was compromised during an extraction operation. Communication failure. Delayed support. 4 casualties in the first hour. His voice did not change in register or pace. It remained what it had been, controlled, precise. The voice of someone for whom the discipline of delivery was a form of respect for the content. She kept 2 operators alive through the night with a field kit and no backup. One of them was a father of 3. One of them is currently running a training program for Navy medical personnel. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. The 3rd person she treated that night did not survive, despite everything she did. She left the service 8 months later. The room absorbed this the way rooms absorb information. That reorders what they thought they understood. Young nurse near the back of the corridor looked down at the floor. A doctor who had been standing at his desk with his arms crossed had quietly uncrossed them. The desk attendant who had calculated the old man's insurance status from across the corridor stood very still with his hand resting on the desk. Surface as though he needed the contact. Chief Navarro spoke into the silence. When she knelt down next to me, he said quietly, I knew within 30 seconds. The pressure application, the way she checked my pupils, the way she positioned herself. He looked at no one in particular. You don't learn that in a cleaning job. Holt tried once more, his voice now carrying the particular strain of a man constructing an argument he no longer fully believes. Regardless of her history, this hospital has standards and procedures that exist to protect patients and staff alike. She acted outside those boundaries, and the decision to, you struck her. The general's voice had not changed. That was the most clarifying thing about it. There was no escalation, no additional edge, no performance of outrage. The sentence arrived with the same controlled weight as every sentence before it, which somehow made it heavier than any of them. Holt said nothing. In front of your staff, the general continued, you struck a Navy veteran and combat medic who had just stabilized a patient. Your people were leaving on the floor. He looked at Holt with an expression that was not anger and not contempt, but something more durable than either, the settled, clear-eyed assessment of a man who is finished forming an opinion. And then you ended her employment. The CEO's mouth opened and then closed. Behind the general, through the rain-streaked glass of the east entrance, the parking lot sat empty except for the helicopter and the 2 soldiers standing at its side, and the steady beat of the rotors carried faintly through, the walls like a clock that had not stopped running. Since it arrived, Rosa had walked 4 blocks. Before she stopped, she was not sure why she stopped at that particular corner, under the awning of a closed pharmacy, with the rain coming down steadily across the empty street and the morning traffic moving past in the slow, deliberate way of drivers who have accepted that the weather has made punctuality optional. She had walked away from jobs before. She had walked away from harder things than jobs. The mechanism of departure was familiar enough that she could execute it without thinking, which was usually the point. What had made her pause was not grief and not anger. It was the particular exhaustion of recognizing a pattern for the second time. The first time had been in a different country, in different clothes, in a situation where the stakes of the system's indifference were measured in blood rather than paperwork. She had told herself afterward that civilian life would be different, that hospitals were built around the same instinct that had sent her into the field, the preservation of life, the refusal to let the preventable become the permanent. 14 months at St. Mercy had been a slow and patient education in how wrong she had been. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small metal object she had touched earlier. It was a service pin, worn smooth at the edges, the kind of thing that accumulates meaning, not through ceremony, but through time. She had carried it the way some people carry photographs, not to look at, but to confirm that something real had happened, that there had been a version of herself who had known exactly what she was doing and why. Even in the worst hours of it, she closed her fingers around it and looked out at the rain. She did not hear the footsteps immediately. When she did register them, her body had already begun a quiet recalibration. It performed whenever she became aware of an approach from behind, weight balanced. Attention widened, the low hum of readiness that 14 months of corridor cleaning had muffled, but not erased. She turned before the person reached her dot. The general stopped under the edge of the awning. His uniform was damp across the shoulders. He had come alone. Rosa looked at him for a moment without speaking. Behind him, 2 blocks back, she could see the faint outline of the hospital building through the rain, and above the parking lot trees, the slow rotation of the helicopters. Blades, Ms. Mendez, he said. General, she said. He looked at her with the direct assessment she remembered from the love. brief window she had observed him. Through the corridor glass, the quality of attention that evaluated without judgment and arrived at conclusions without announcing them. Chief Navarro called us from inside the hospital, he said. He recognized your work before he recognized your face. Rosa said nothing. The closure on his wound, the pressure technique, the way you checked him without making it look like a check. The general's voice was level. He said it took him about 40 seconds to be certain. Rosa looked down at the service pin in her hand, then closed her fingers around it again. I left that work behind, she said. I know, the general said. He told us that too. He was quiet for a moment, the rain filling the space between sentences with its steady, indifferent sound. He also told us what happened inside before we arrived. Rosa's jaw tightened slightly. She said nothing. I've spoken to the hospital administrator, the general said. Not Holt, the board administrator. She was reached 20 minutes ago. He paused. Gerald Holt's tenure at St. Mercy is being reviewed effective this morning. The grounds include the conduct witnessed by multiple staff members in the East Corridor. He did not frame this as news delivered for her benefit. He delivered it the way he had delivered everything else, as fact, stated cleanly, without decoration. That process will take its course independent of anything you decide to do next. Rosa looked out at the rain for a moment. You didn't need to come out here to tell me that, she said. No, the general agreed. She looked back at him. His expression had shifted slightly from the controlled authority it had carried inside the hospital. Not softened exactly, but more direct in the way that people become direct when they have stopped managing an audience and are simply speaking to one person. Chief Navarro asked me to tell you something, he said. He said you told him that you helped him because he was bleeding, and that was enough reason. A brief pause. He said that is the same reason you kept 2 of our people alive through a 9-hour situation 3 years ago, with no support and no guarantee of extraction. The general looked at her steadily. He wanted you to know that those 2 people are both still alive, and that neither of them has forgotten who made that possible. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. The rain moved across the street in slow diagonal lines, and somewhere down the block a car horn sounded once and then fell silent. She opened her hand and looked at the service pin lying in her palm. Then she closed her fingers around it one more time and put it back in her pocket. What happens to the patients, she said, while Holt's review happens? What happens to the people who come through that east entrance with no paperwork and no insurance and someone behind the desk doing a calculation? The general held her gaze. That depends partly on who is in the corridor when they arrive. He said it was not a recruitment pitch. It did not contain an offer, a promise, or a condition. It was simply an observation, stated with the plainness of someone who trusts the person they are speaking to reach their own conclusions. Rosa looked back at the hospital, building through the rain, inside the East Corridor. She knew the staff who had watched her work and watched her walk out, and then watched. A general read her record aloud into the silence of their moaning were still there, processing the distance between what they had assumed and what they now understood. The desk attendant who had calculated the old man's insurance, the nurses who had looked at the floor, the doctor who had uncrossed his arms. Systems were made of people, and people occasionally remembered, when given enough reason, that the system was supposed to serve something larger than its own continuity. She turned and began walking back toward the hospital, not quickly, not with ceremony, with the same steady, unhurried stride she had used for 14 months of early morning corridors, the walk of someone who has decided that the task in front of her is the only thing worth thinking about, and who has identified, with clarity, what the task is. The general walked beside her without comment. When they reached the east entrance, the automatic doors opened before either of them touched the handle. Inside, the corridor was quiet in the way it goes quiet when a room has been through something and has not yet decided what to do with the understanding. Several faces turned toward the entrance. The desk attendant looked up. Dr. Reyes, who had returned to the corridor at some point in the preceding minutes, stood near the triage bay with her hands at her sides. Chief Navarro was leaning against the far wall with his arms folded and the faint expression of a man who had expected this outcome from approximately the moment he hit the floor. Rosa stopped just inside the doors. The general took one step forward, turned to face her, and rendered a salute. It was not performed. It was not held for effect or audience. It was simply given with the clean precision of someone for whom the gesture carried an exact meaning, and who intended that meaning to be received without ambiguity. Rosa stood in her gray cleaning uniform in the flickering fluorescent light of the east corridor and accepted it the way she had accepted everything that morning, without argument, without theater, with the quiet steadiness of someone who has never needed the confirmation but understands in this moment that it is being offered on behalf of people who are not in the room. She gave a small, single nod. Behind the desk, one of the nurses let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. Nobody spoke. The ventilation hummed. The rain continued outside, indifferent and steady, against the glass. Some people spend their lives proving who they are to rooms that have already decided. The ones who carry the most never feel the need to prove anything at all.